Well, the Luis Botifold Oral History Project was established, as I understand it, a number of years ago to begin the important work of collecting stories of the Cuban diaspora. The emphasis, I think, at the time that the project was started was to really focus on the history of community leaders, defined broadly. And that work proceeded, I think, with a sort of a steady clip for a number of years. For me, as the still relatively new Bacati Chair for Cuban Studies, I look at that as sort of a first step toward what I think is a much broader potential that we have to be collecting Cuban diaspora oral histories on a more continuous basis. And that's really the direction that we're hoping to head, to sort of build on the work that was started with the Luis Botifold Project and expand it in a number of ways. What? Well, as a historian, I mean, I work first and foremost with paper kinds of sources of information. The bread and butter of a lot of what colleagues and I do is work with archives of different kinds, like many of the archival collections that are here at the Cuban Heritage Collection, to begin telling different kinds of stories about Cuban history and Cuban diaspora history. But of course, not everything is preserved on paper. Not every experience that matters or can tell us something important about the Cuban experience ends up on a piece of paper in an archive. And so oral testimonies, in the Cuban case, in any case really, are really an important sort of complementary source space that we have to sort of fully flesh out the histories that matter to us. I think it was important that this work started many years ago with a focus on that first generation of folks who came in the 1960s and some of their children. And that work will continue because it remains really important. As time passes, our ability to collect some of those stories may decrease for the obvious reasons. So that needs to remain a focus, absolutely. But that needs to be complemented, in my view, with a look at other stories, the stories of Cubans who came in the Mariel boat lift in the 1980s. Those are stories that we've collected some of, but at this point are somewhat underrepresented in our collection. The stories of Cubans who have come since the 1990s. The stories of the nearly 500,000 Cubans who have come in the last 3 years. An utterly historic migration that, in terms of intensity, really makes some of the prior migration waves pale by comparison. It's important that we're collecting stories and oral testimonies that we're in danger of losing, but also those that are the freshest, right? Because we know that memory is imperfect, and it's important to get people's stories as soon as we can, if we can.
And if possible?
Well, I think some of that is still to be determined. My sense of the origins of the San Isidro project was that it was sort of envisioned at a particular moment in time to capture a set of stories. I think long-term, sure. We'd love to be a place that is a repository for Cuban stories of all kinds. Cubans here, Cubans there, Cubans in Alaska, Cubans in Spain, you name it, right? I think our starting place, and I think it makes sense for us as an institution, given our location, is to be a place that is collecting the stories of the Cuban diaspora experience understood in its full diversity. With an obvious focus on South Florida, because that's where we are, but also reaching beyond to New York and New Jersey, to Spain, to some of the newer Cuban communities that are forming and have formed over the last 10, 20 years. The fastest growing Cuban community by some estimates in the country is in Louisville, Kentucky. We should be collecting those stories too, as a collection that aspires to be sort of the #1 repository for outside of Cuba, certainly, for archives and testimonies of the Cuban experience.
Do you have anything else? What that does for you as an academic?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think our opportunities for expanding our oral history work are multiple. As I said, we need to continue to collect the stories of that founding generation of the Cuban exile community in the 1960s that we're in danger of losing. But we also need to broaden the sort of range of those stories that we collect, right? For me, as a scholar, as someone who wants to write a social history of just everyday life, for example, in the Cuban exile community in the 1960s and 70s, the story of the man or woman who became a community leader is really important, as is the story of this sort of quote-unquote everyday man, right? I don't know about you, but sometimes I get more important life lessons from my barber than some of my professional mentors. And so I think valuing the testimonies of Cubans in the diaspora from all walks of life, from all racial backgrounds, from all sort of generational cohorts of this Cuban diaspora experience that has now, been ongoing for 60 plus years, and really trying to capture the stories of, I think, moments in our history that, frankly, are too little understood. Moments like the Maryville boat lift, moments like the 1994 rafter crisis, and on and on and on, right? So I think really expanding the range of the stories we collect is really, really important in providing scholars, students, but also community members a sort of a fuller portrait of our community in all of its richness, in terms of gender, race, political affiliation and background. All of that is really important. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that's out there about the Cuban exile community or diaspora is that the community is a monolith. It has never been. And it's important that our oral history collecting, I think, provides a window into that complexity.
One more request, and that is that you introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Mike Bustamante. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Miami. I'm also the Emilio Bacardi Moro Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies. And last but not least, I'm the Director of Academic Programs at the Cuban Heritage Collection.
I'm going to ask you to do that one more time so we have options.
My name is Michael Bustamante, Associate Professor of History, Emilio Bacardi Moro Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies, and Director of Academic Programs at the Cuban Heritage Collection. I can also just say one of those if you want.
That is totally fine.
It's a lot.
What did we miss? What do you want the viewer to know, walk away with?
Well, I did have one comment or question about framing. So I think it's important that this not be framed as this is the new phase of the Boltifol project, per se, because the Boltifol project was really amigos driven and led, and that's to be recognized and celebrated, and I can say something about that if you want. But sort of for off camera, as I was saying before, what we're trying to do is sort of steer this work back to the academic center, because I think that'll give it greater sort of running room over time, and that gets into some of the diversity issues that we need to address in this collecting, and I think having scholars be the ones that are collecting the oral history, right? So I think what we're envisioning is, imagine a kind of a landing page on the Cuban Heritage Collection site that's, oral history, period. And the Boltifol project may continue to exist as a place where we do continue to collect those community leader stories, since that was the focus. But imagine sort of different folders that are different chapters, right? A folder on Mariel stories, a folder on Balsero crisis stories, a folder on this, on that, a folder on the experiences of Cubans of color in the diaspora. So we're thinking of the Boltifol thing as one piece of a much broader whole, but the Boltifol thing is not the framework for the whole, if that makes sense.
And when you say bring it back to academic, will the people interviewing the subjects be academics?
That's the goal. I mean, our goal is to fundraise so that we can endow a permanent oral history program here at the Cuban Heritage Collection that would require its own staff. So the idea, this is sort of still in the pie in the sky phase, would be to fund, that endowment would fund, as one possibility, for example, a postdoctoral fellowship. So someone applies, it's a postdoctoral fellowship of 3 years. Their responsibility is to come here and lead the oral history efforts for the term of their postdoctoral fellowship with, in my dream vision, 2 graduate assistants who are helping them do the work. So it's a scholar with a PhD who's coming to do that work, and then it's a sort of it's a short-term position that it's renewed. We've also talked about maybe actually just trying to, endow a permanent position, right, where it's a permanent person who's in charge of this project, and that's what they do. But yeah, we'd be looking for an academic who has experience in the methodology of oral history. Maybe it's worth saying something about that, because I think one of the critiques that I have, and I won't say this on camera, obviously, of the prior oral history work is that some of the interviewers that were selected in the past you got the sense that people were interviewing someone that they already knew, and it was kind of a little bit friendly, and not that that's bad, you want to establish rapport, but the interviews weren't conducted, I think, with an eye to sort of what we know now in terms of methodology and theory of doing oral history. And also the sense that oral history is just like any other kind of historical source, you have to think about critically, right? Like, oral history can fill a gap that the paper source base a gap in the paper source space, but I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, right? Memory is imperfect. And I think part of the work that we do as scholars is also thinking about oral history critically too, right? So I think that's what I mean in terms of sort of bringing it back to an academic focus. So we want to marry both. We want to marry something that I think continues the spirit of the initial initiatives here, but that I think is really being driven from the scholarly side in a way that prior efforts were not, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because that helps frame my story.
Yeah, great, thank you.
And at the same time, though, in the back of my head, because I'm a journalist, I've seen oral history, interviews, but you have to sort of like weigh, and this is just my opinion, methodology and academics with, make it relatable. You know what I mean? And happy and reader friendly.
Well, it goes to sort of a whole bunch of questions that we have to resolve, which is when we're collecting oral histories, what's the degree of production value that we're doing this? I mean, I don't think in terms of, we're academic oral history projects that exist out there, they're not necessarily producing sort of a highly produced video for every oral history. Like we've done that, I think, for these high profile ones that we're featuring in this event because it makes sense to do that and they also serve another purpose, right? But is that going to be what we do for every single interview that we do? Probably not. I mean, we have to make some decisions. Are we doing video? Are we just doing audio? I mean, I think video is good, but there are cost considerations and things like that, right? So I think it depends on what your goal is, right? Like some oral histories can be produced with the goal of them being in a documentary or something that does have a mass audience. Others are really just intent to collect the story and then let people access it. So I think that's finding the right balance there is something that we have to work on. So anyway, it's a long way of saying, but I can say any of that if you think it would be useful.
Why don't you go ahead and frame that for us so that we have another option to go ahead and choose from.
Okay, let me think about how to frame it. Maybe I'll just frame the bit about, I'm a little uncertain if I have the permission to sort of say on camera whether our goal is to hire a person who is doing this work.
I wouldn't get that specific.
I wouldn't get that specific.
I think what you mentioned, and for my purposes, that the CHC and the university wants to expand, what is already a very robust, oral history project and bring in, and then you mentioned, the academic and the more, the methodology.
Well, the thing is, it's robust, but I won't say it this way, but oral history has been collected here kind of in fits and starts. Right. It happens and then it disappears, and it happens and then it disappears, and then someone wants to do an interview, and it's not consistent.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, there was a period where it was being done consistently, but I think that's fallen off. And part of that is about resources. So anyway, I think...
So what does the CHC and you and your role want to now launch as an oral history project?
We want to create a broader, more continuous framework in which oral history collecting is happening here at the collection, which is work that really sits at the intersection of the archival practice of this collection, right? These are stories that we need to collect and preserve, but also the scholarly initiatives that we're seeking to sort of incubate here in terms of oral history being a really important source for academic research. In the past, oral history has been collected here at different moments in varying degrees of intensity with particular sort of a particular focus. We're looking to really launch and hopefully build the platform for sustaining an oral history project dedicated to the history of the Cuban diaspora that is continuous, ongoing, right? That is collecting a certain amount of interviews every single year, transcribing those interviews, making them available to the public, making them available to researchers, thinking about how to repackage some of those interviews, perhaps in audiovisual format that's more appropriate for a general public. There's a lot of uses that oral history can have, but really also thinking about the academic mission of this collection at its heart and the ways in which these histories can serve as a really important source for researchers seeking to understand various parts of the Cuban experience. Another important thing to think about in terms of oral history is collecting oral history also with a critical eye, right? Oral histories that you have to be intentional in seeking out the full range of experiences of a particular community. And just as it's true that oral history can sort of fill in a gap in sort of the written record, we also have to treat oral history critically, right? We know we're only human, our memories are infallible, right? And so that's why it's important sort of on the recording side of an oral history to have someone often with a scholarly background who kind of knows deeply the history or the moment that's being discussed, because that can sort of allow for a back and forth, right, about certain aspects of the story that perhaps require clarification or elaboration or things like that. So I think in that spirit broadly is what we're thinking. Was that useful? Okay, awesome. Thank you guys.
Great. And why is it significant? So just so you think about it.
Right, we're ready, Barbara, whenever you are.
And my iPhone is on?
Oh, I would have forgot. Here, can you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks. So Amanda, tell me what the Luis Botifol Oral History Project is and why is it significant?
The Luis J. Botifol Oral History Project is a community history initiative that documents the stories of early exiles from Cuba. It's an important initiative because it captured the stories of the early waves of exile from after the 1959 revolution, from professionals to entrepreneurs, artists and creatives. So we have firsthand accounts of their migration stories, as well as their experience in the South Florida community primarily.
How many are there, and can you talk about maybe a few that you remember that are really important?
So there are over 118 interviews in the project. The project began in 2008, so we've been steadily collecting interviews since then. I would say the most important interviews, I can't put my finger on the most important one, but I would definitely say we have interviews with, for example, Willie Chirino, Alvarez Guedes. There are also interviews that document, for example, the Mariel boat lift, particularly a lot of the interviews focus on sort of South Florida Cuban diaspora experience. So we get a really deep knowledge and documentation of those stories.
I understand that part of the project also involves documenting what is happening in Cuba and the San Isidro movement. How did that come about, and tell us what it's about? So
we have a separate oral history project, the Movimiento San Isidro Oral History Project, and that was an initiative that was spearheaded by the Amigos of the Cuban Heritage Collection, which is our friends group. They thought it was very important, and we agreed to document the experience of political protests in Cuba, beginning from 2018 to 2021. So we did those interviews on Zoom, and we were able to connect with artists that were living in Cuba at the time. Some were already exiled to different parts of the world, including Spain or Miami, and we were able to document their stories fighting against censorship on the island. So that was an excellent documentation initiative that we were able to do with the help of the Amigos.
Do you recall will the scholars who listen to it be able to get a sweep of the fact that, we have political prisoners, that we have entertainers, that we also have entrepreneurs? Speak a little bit about the range of interviews that we have.
The oral history projects that we've done have a really wide range of participants, from entrepreneurs to political figures, as well as artists and writers, civic activists. So we have a really broad range within the project, and it really captures the full story of the Cuban diaspora experience.
And how, you said it started in 2008. When were the last ones done, and what do you foresee for the future with this project?
The most recent interviews were done in 2022. So we were able to do a series of interviews with entrepreneurs, including Jorge Perez, Armando Codina, Jose Barret, Maria Alonso, Carlos Quintela, and Mike Fernandez. So we were really able to capture their trajectories professionally, as well as their lives here in our community. We were also able to interview Manny Medina as part of this project. So we are trying to expand the sort of professions that we have captured in the project, from technology to civic engagement, the arts. So we're really able to capture broad stories.
Answering Barbara.
Okay, so the initial interviews that we worked on really documented the sort of professionals in our community, the well-known people, and what we're wanting to do to expand the project is to capture more everyday stories. So for example, stories of LGBTQ experiences, stories of diverse racial and ethnic groups within the Cuban diaspora. We think it's very important to have the full picture within the project. And while we love documenting the well-known people within our community, we also want to capture the stories of the average person so that they feel included in the project and their story also matters, and we want them to feel represented in the collection.
Why are oral histories different and perhaps a little more relevant than reading this in a book?
So oral histories give us a first-hand account from the person that experienced a historic event, for example. And we really like having this type of content in our collections so that students, scholars, and the community at large can understand the diaspora experience from that first-hand perspective versus something like a secondary source like a book.
Is there any similar project, oral history, that relates to Cubans anywhere else?
This is really the premier oral history project dealing with the Cuban diaspora community at this time. There are other oral history projects that are more narrow in scope, but our efforts and our focus are really to expand the project as much as possible.
I've got one more. What is the process of getting one of these oral histories, and why do you need more funding for it?
So we look within the community to see who we can capture as part of the oral history project. And we have had very generous funding for the project from different sources. For example, the Amigos of the Cuban Heritage Collection, our friends group, were really integral in getting the project off the ground in 2008. We've also received independent grants from, for example, the Marlins Foundation in 2013 to do a human rights oral history project as well. We really need a consistent funding source to be able to grow the project to the level that we want it to be at. And something like an endowment would help us to be able to have consistency in the project and continue to grow and expand into different series. We're interested in doing series of artists, interviews with professionals, the everyday people, as we mentioned earlier. So we're hopeful that we can continue to grow the project and expand the voices that are present.
And I saw that some interviews are an hour long, while others go on for hours. Is that depending on the person, or how do you choose that?
The length of the interview depends on the person. So it really depends on how much they want to open up, how much they remember. For example, a lot of the people that we interviewed early on in the project were older and maybe had less memories of time in Cuba, for example. But we are really open to the length of the interview. Some of the interviews are 4 hours long, some are 35 minutes. So it really depends on what the interviewee wants to give us and wants to share.
To address?
There's definitely a sense of urgency in the project, particularly early on. When we started the project in 2008, we focused on the first waves of exiles, people who at that point were in their 70s, 80s, 90s. And the key thing about oral history work is that if you don't capture the story while the person is alive, it's gone, and their connection to that history won't be recorded. So we're very keen to continue recording sort of our older generations. We do want to diversify the project so that we have a lot of different representation, but there has been a focus historically on the older generations of exile. And for that, we have really key stories that we've been able to capture.
And how can the public access this? Many people do not know about it, but how can they access it?
The oral histories are accessible on our website, library.miami.edu/chc. And anyone can look at them online. They're available to the public and there's no access restriction, so anyone's able to look at them online. Good, doors closed. Okay, so oral history interviews provide a lot of information beyond what's said and spoken in the interview. You get to learn about the interviewee's personality, how they interact with the interviewer, so you get a fuller picture of their story, not just in their words, but in their body language and how they express themselves.
I think there's a really solid difference in reading something and then you're sort of putting your emotion into it versus watching somebody tell it with that same emotion.
Right. You're really able to feel the connection with the person versus reading something in a book. Of course, books are important and you get information from them, but it's a different kind of experience for the audience and the researcher to have that sort of firsthand experience with a subject.
All right, cool.
As far as anything else, I think I'm just going to say one more thing. We really are looking for the community's support to continue to expand our work in the oral history field. It's an essential component of archival work, and we hope to be able to continue these projects.
Do me a favor, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Amanda Moreno. I'm the Esperanza Bravo de Varona Chair and Director of the Cuban Heritage Collection.
Cool. Anything we missed? You good? All right, sweet.
Yep.
Hey, Robert, for the next interview,